Fiction is not a cheat code. It changes the code base.
If fiction is such a cheat code, then tell me this. Why do all ambitious professionals all read the same business and self-improvement books? Are these books really making you a better human being?
You're not going to learn it from a behavioral pop-psy book to look at your friend and say, you don't seem well. Do you want to take a walk and tell me what's going on?
That's Anna Gatt, an entrepreneur, a community builder, and one of the most well-read people on this planet. She thinks you'll be a better business person, partner, and friend if you read more fiction. On this episode, we discuss how fiction introduces you to the breadth of human experience, how you need to understand the genealogy and context of ideas, and why reading shouldn't solely be about utility or productivity. And make sure you check out the massive reading list in the description below. Now let's jump in.
Yeah, well, tell me. So you are an entrepreneur. You're just a connoisseur of culture, a polymath. These are the ways I see you, not the way you describe yourself. But when you host these amazing salons through your company, Intellect, and when someone asks you, like, Anna, what is it that you do? How do you describe it?
Wow, that's such a difficult philosophical question right away to kick off with. I usually say that I'm the founder and CEO of Intellect. Intellect is a curated marketplace of events where artists and intellectuals with an amazing community tier for people who really just want to do this with their lives. We have a bunch of events every day, online and offline, series and one-offs, with or without a special guest, where we gather people from around the world who want to enjoy having a life of the mind, who want to indulge in the examined life like your listeners and viewers. And we create a way for creators to monetize this. So you could see Intellect as a creator platform for high culture, for people, whether they actually come from high culture themselves, like myself, with a background in academia. I mean, I kind of come from both highbrow and lowbrow, or pop culture, high culture, because I did study philosophy, linguistics, theater making. But I also worked in TV with rock bands, building audiences, producing albums, and so as I do have film and TV experience as well. And so I think when you have my background, you see a very small gap between high culture and low culture. You realize that so much of this is kind of just a historical whim of how something was viewed at the time. I'm pretty sure Homer was pop culture and people were listening to episodes of the Odyssey around the campfire and they were not thinking, oh my God, I'm doing high culture now after, a day in the fields. They were just like, yay, battles and naked women. For them, this was the Game of Thrones. So swords and girls. But I think very early on learned that the gap between creator and audience is also quite small. So I wanted to create something where you can be a host and also attend other people's events, but you can also just attend events and at some point be like, I want to host my own stuff, and for the leap that you have to take at that moment should become very small. Or I'm a reader, but now I want to start writing as well and give that empowering boost to people.
And I've been to your events as both participant and as host, and you bring together this so many corners of the internet, and it's really incredible, and I really encourage any of our listeners and viewers to go check it out. It's funny, you said high culture and low culture. Actually, I actually never heard that framing before. And so high culture being like the land of ideas, like intellectuals, and I think of like Marie Antoinette, or someone with a cigar, discussing a book, and low culture being more kind of the discourse amongst the masses. Is that a fair?
I mean, the most conservative way of framing it, say in the late 20th century, would say classical music, the classics, reading the classic novels, old-timey playwrights are high culture, things that stood the trials of time, right? We have this idea that we read Shakespeare because it is so good that every era agrees that it's good. And then you have pop culture, which is, in a very kind of German post-Hegelian way of thinking about the world would be something where it's very momentary, it's interchangeable. I actually wrote one of my diplomas on how stupid this idea is. Because, first of all, jazz used to be the lowest form of culture. It used to be the music of speakeasies where the lower classes would go and the upper classes in secret, right? And then at some point, people decided that we should not, like, we should sit in an auditorium seriously listening to jazz, which is about dancing. And I was once in London at the Barbican, and during the jazz festival, during the breaks, the artists would come out and do jazz sessions in the kind of lobby of the building. It was very rainy outside, of course, being in London, so everybody was just kind of congregating and getting all smelly, in the lobby. And it was so funny that inside for like 300 pounds, you could sit straight listening to jazz. But outside, the kids didn't give a damn about the rules. They don't know about high culture, low culture. And all the children were dancing to the jazz. And it was so liberating. Like, yes, this is how it should be. Actually, a lot of classical music should also be enjoyed with movement. And so I wrote my degree on how dumb this division line is, but also what happens when, like, Bob Dylan was pop culture when he happened, right? He was playing in these bars and it was all about the music, like the radio industry and the record industry. But then he won a Nobel Prize, so it would be really hard to argue right now that Bob Dylan is like for the lower classes, and it's a very classist way of writing it.
I think too with like Kendrick Lamar, right? Is like a rapper who
Exactly.
also won
Like one of
the
the greatest
Pulitzer,
poets
right?
alive.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. Fascinating. All right. So we're going to jump into the question. But before we jump into the question, if you are a driven, ambitious professional who is obsessed with reading nonfiction to better yourself and always measuring yourself against a measure of utility and, free market thinking and your own market value, you might be looking for a change. And so check out our group coaching programs over at radreads.co/coaching, where we can help you navigate those career pivots. Okay, so the question, should you read more fiction? And I shared this tweet, but I've seen this across the board. So our audience, very kind of type A driven, left brain bankers, consultants, lawyers, entrepreneurs, and they're obsessed with reading nonfiction, right? It's everything from the lean startup to atomic habits to infinite games to thinking fast and slow to I could go on a sovereign individual. I could go on and on and on. And I've given these polls out. I've done these polls on Twitter and in the courses that I've taught. And I would say that on average, most people are heavy readers, but they'll read 1 to 2 books that are fiction per year. And the answer, one person answered a tweet, he said -10. I was like, what does that even mean? It's like, are you gonna like read nonfiction when you die? Or did you read it in the womb? Or I don't even
It's like,
want to
negative 10 is when you stop 10 people from also reading fiction. That's negative 10.
Exactly. He is a books influencer, so you're right. That's how he does it. So, and I can relate to that. As someone who has been very much like I read for a big part of my life. It's like I read to increase my skills, and if I increase my skills, good things happen in my life. Which, like for me, was like I want to like get rich and get laid, right? So it's like nonfiction is is like get skills, become more valuable of an employee or a business person. So I'll stop there. Like, how does that land for you?
As you describe people's kind of seeking better outcomes through reading nonfiction, you're making me think of cheat codes.
Hmm.
People are acquiring these cheat codes, learning them through these incredible nonfiction books. And they are very important for life, right? There's a reason why there's a famous book called Thinking Fast and Slow. For fast thinking, you need to acquire these really good routines and knee jerk reactions as individuals, we are very, very deeply responsible for the outcomes in our lives, right? And I greatly admire people who take up this responsibility openly and say, I'm doing my best to be useful in society, to create wealth for my children, and like fulfill my potential. Reading fiction is not a cheat code. It changes the code base. When you read a book, when you read a novel, you're not the same person on the last page as you were on the first page. I do think that there is a utility, even short-term utility for reading fiction, but the best outcomes, like with other greatly fulfilling activities in life, from deep love to spending time with your parents to just having a really good chat with your children, or even having children, you're not looking for a cheat code. You're looking for changing the code base.
Yeah.
Because I would say that maybe nonfiction books are about the how, but fiction is about the what. Like, okay, more productive. Who is this person who is going to be more productive? So my first instinct here would be to just rethink what utility means and what's the difference between short-term utility and long-term utility. I mean, your incredible work is all about understanding that there are no real shortcuts, even in our careers, right? You can't, there's no spiritual bypassing on the journey of understanding who we are and what life's purpose is. So when people turn to meditation, when they turn to mindfulness practices through movement or spending time in nature, or when they have a religious practice, right? I mean, religion is very similar in the sense that, you go to church, you go to the synagogue, you go to the mosque, and you every week or every day, depending on, or every Christmas, or depending on how frequently you go, you will be presented with narratives that happened to other people, right? Or happened to this fictional person in a parable, right? And it's fulfilling and important for an individual to understand the many ways that somebody in the Bible, like Job, responded to hardship, right? God is testing or allowing Satan to test Job, and Job gives all the natural human responses, and the friends give the natural responses. And, people who love stories, which is everybody, will understand that, oh, I actually leave this thought experiment a more fulfilled person because I understand myself more and I feel more empowered to deal with the adversities and unexpected events in life because I understand the fundamentals better. And by the way, most of fiction is also full of such parables. They are full of, if you read Dale Carnegie to Esther Perel, it's story after story after story of people with fictional names and, exaggerated characteristics. It's kind of fiction, right? So I would think that this is more something to do with how humans really understand the world and each other through stories, however long-term or short-term the outcome they are seeking might be.
Yeah. As you were saying, that's beautifully said, and you're so right. Like I haven't read any Esther Perel, but I was thinking of there's a book by I forget, it's like one of the kind of original, like Jack Kornfield, Mark Epstein, Dr. Mark Epstein. So he's got a
Yeah.
Buddhist philosopher, Buddhist psychologist, psychotherapist, and every single chapter is obfuscated, exaggerated story of one of his therapy sessions. Like there's no
I mean,
lesson. Like there are lessons.
it's the ultimate business book, self-help book. It's a novel. It's written in the form
Which
of a
one? Sorry.
novel. The Goal.
Oh, the goal. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yourself. And trust me,
Yeah.
most autobiographies are also mostly fiction. Like
Yes.
nobody is that cool all the time, and no stories
Yeah.
that somebody really sculpted that that narrative so it
Totally.
makes
Totally. I wanted to so you said you read a book and you said I'm paraphrasing, but you leave transformed. So I actually thinking, I was thinking of some of my what's that?
if it's a good book. If it's not a good
Yeah,
book, stop reading because you're wasting your
yeah.
time. You don't have to
So I
finish
was
books. Like if it's not a good
yes.
book, you're stuck there. And I would prefer for you to read 4 other books in the time you're suffering through an unenjoyable time.
Okay. I'm gonna come back to that because I hit a point there. But I was thinking of some of my favorite books as you were speaking. So it's like there's Norwegian Wood by Murakami. And I'm like, how did I leave that transformed? And actually, I think as you said that, I'm like, I think I had a deeper understanding of sadness and loneliness. And I
Oh,
never actually thought about that until you just said that. Like you left it
yeah.
transformed. So then another
That
one of
it's
my
okay
favorite
to be
books.
sad, right? That it's okay to be sad, and it's okay
Yeah.
to embrace that feeling as a part of life, which is not necessarily something that not a very quick result seeking nonfiction book will tell you. A nonfiction book will be
Yeah.
about how not to be sad. And
I know.
Murakami is like, how to be sad. That's the
uh,
difference.
like, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Here's how to be sad at 200 beautiful pages. Then I was thinking
Where are
about
the
The
other
Secret
books? Okay.
History. Secret History by Donna Tartt. And it's been a long time since I read both of those books, but I remember there it's that like when you do something bad and you're scared of getting in trouble. Like everyone's done that. Once I almost killed my friend's hamster because I spun the wheel. Like I was like 6 years old. I spun the wheel too fast and it flung the hamster across like the tank. And then it was like lying there. And I was like, oh my God, I killed a hamster. You imagine being like 8 years old and be like, I killed a hamster. And I was like, I wonder if he can recover fast enough
Yeah.
to like maybe I just like he's out of breath or something and like before like they see it. So this like this feeling that I'm like, did I kill the hamster? Did I kill the hamster? Did I kill the hamster? It's so funny. I was watching the show Industry, which is about Wall Street traders in London. Same thing happened. The woman made the mistake and she tried to hide a trading mistake, a first year analyst. And she's just like, if certain things happen, the mistake will just be washed away. And you're just like, so we've all done that. We've all had that thing where you make this mistake and you're like, there's a chance that no one will notice. But that moment between you're like validated or not is such a human feeling. And so anyway, I won't go on and
No,
on with
this
my
is
books.
such an important. I mean, you read a behavioral science book about how people deal with guilt or our built-in instinct to avoid doing harm, and it's really important. And maybe if you really, really memorize it and you have a visual memory and use cue cards, you will, or space repetition cards, you will somehow remember the bullet point list on this page. But you read Of Mice and Men, read Crime and Punishment, read A Secret History, and you don't have to memorize it because your
Yeah.
soul will remember the story of these other people. Or you can read How to Get Rich Quick books, or you can watch Citizen Kane and reflect on this human story of, okay, I get rich, and then what of
Mm,
my family? What of will the love of my life benefit? Will read, Joseph Roth. Okay, the son gets super rich. How will the father who never made it that successful react to that? What will that do to that father-son relationship? It's not the same as reading, I don't know, Alain de Botton on self-sabotage and how some people stop themselves from self-sabotaging because they whatever. Read what happens when you don't. I mean, of
yeah.
course, I want everybody to be as successful as they can be, but you have to understand what happens when these goals are pursued and what the nuances are, and all these other people who are the human community who are part of your story, right?
Yeah. It made me think of a conversation you and I had, it was actually exactly a year ago. And we're talking about money, but we started talking about the book Fleischman is in Trouble.
Oh
And
yeah.
so for those who aren't familiar, Fleischman is in Trouble is about this like it's like Upper East, like it's like rich New Yorkers and their private school tribulations and all that. And they made a TV series about it. And I will tell you that TV series is like a real test for people's relationship, their marriage, because it's about a really fucked up marriage. Like the marriage is fucked up, and there's a lot of dark things happening, and a lot of very real things. You're like, oh, that's happened to me, or I've said that, or I've been on the receiving end of that. And it's funny, Anna, like when I spoke to people, my wife and I loved the TV series, and we've had a challenging marriage, and we've gone to therapy and all that, and then we would talk about it with other people, and they'd be like, "I turned it off after the second episode, like I couldn't," and it was just like such a test of like
Oh,
how they saw that, like
wait.
it was such a mirror to their own marriages.
Uh,
And so I mean, it's fiction, right? It's a
you know,
fictional book, but
in
that's a perfect example.
1974, Ingmar Bergman's TV series Scenes from a Marriage came out on Swedish television. It was a 4-part series with Liv Ullmann. And then they later on cut it into a very good movie as well. And it started a wave of divorce in
Wow.
Scandinavia.
What was the name of the movie?
Scenes from a Marriage.
Scenes from a Marriage.
And,
Cool.
right now you watch it and everything seems so obvious. But at the time, I don't know, maybe it was 1973 and 4.
Wow.
Um, but at the time, it was so, it was such a taboo breaker because it
Great
just
movie.
showed a middle class couple with seemingly small financial and social conflicts. But the people who lived it, they watched it and they were like, this sucks. Like, these are not small problems, right? These are things that make your life less good. And one way sometimes people knee-jerk react to such existential crises is by severing their relationship, right? Because it seems easy, right? It's like it's very often a cope. Not all the time. Like, there are couples who should get a divorce, and if you read a lot of fiction, it might give you an idea of what is a moment when you just like rush into something versus like a bad haircut, versus
Yes.
versus something where this is intolerable and you guys should separate. But it's
Yeah.
really interesting,
Ah,
yeah, Goethe's Young Werther book started a series of suicides. So yeah, fiction is very, very powerful. Stories are very, very
yeah.
powerful. And I really hope that many people will dare to go close to the fire and understand this power, so that they too can have it in their lives.
Yeah.
And it's another utility of reading good fiction.
Yeah. And so another tweet that you and I had, I, I put out the tweet that said something about, how do you develop emotional intelligence? And everyone had, read this book by the Daniel Goleman book, or, sit in a park and observe people, or be a good listener, and, a lot of tactics. And you always come in with like the pithiest, hard hitting response. Yours was read Anna Karenina, East of Eden, and The Corrections. And I've read 2 of the 3, but I literally remember nothing about The Corrections. It was probably like 20 years ago, or right when it came out. Anna Karenina I read in middle school.
Wow.
And East of Eden I've actually never read. I'm rereading Anna Karenina now. But say more. Like, what prompted you to
But
say that?
about these 3 books, in many ways, and this speaks to great fiction, any great 3 novels can be listed, right? I could have used a different Victorian novel or 19th century novel. I could have said Father Goriot. I could have used a different book from the 40s. I could have said Sound and the Fury. I could have said a different contemporary novel. You could have said Fleischman is in Trouble. I think they give, first of all 3 books are masterpieces. They deal with extremely serious questions that I think we do have to face in our lives, right? In Anna Karenina, you have the question of redemption, that we are humans and we sin and we harm other people, sometimes in our lives, either willingly or unwittingly. And the question is there a possibility of survival there? Can we move past it? And the book shows that in the 19th century, it was not socially possible, right? For a war, there are many, many books in the 19th century from, Thomas Hardy, et cetera, from Zola, showing that sadly women were not able to leave behind extremely constraining private relationships, even if they suffered abuse or there was a lack of love. And So I think for a contemporary reader, Anna Karenina is both a familiar thing where you're like, I've had this, something like this happened to me. But you also gain maybe a renewed appreciation of the era in which we live, which gives in many lucky places in the world women the freedom to be able to say, I don't love this guy anymore. I love the other one. And everybody's like, well, that's sad, but okay, we are not going to kill you, you know?
Yeah.
Um, East of Eden, I think for American
Oh, just on
history.
Karenina, the opening sentence, right, is every
Oh,
family is messed up, but they're all messed up in their own ways. I mean, you can't read that and be like, oh, like how you feel so seen, right? I mean, so that's
oh my
like
God.
such a universal. I butchered it, but it's like every family is unhappy, but each is unhappy in their own way.
Yeah, every happy family is alike, but every unhappy family is alike in the same way. And you will feel seen, and you will also wonder maybe it's the other way around, right? Maybe it's the happy
Hmm.
families who are all unique, and messed up families are all kind of messed up for the same finite amount of reasons. And you can stop
Totally.
there and
Yeah.
you know have and reflect. I mean, it was written for your reflection. You don't have to rush. It's not. You don't have to extract the information from it. The information of a good novel is you.
Mm,
You are the content, right? And I love this in
wow.
screenwriting. There's this rule that every scene in a movie has to either advance the plot or reveal character.
Mhm.
So maybe the nonfiction book advances the plot and the fiction reveals the character. And both are
Yeah.
integral for a good movie. So I do believe you're right.
Yes. Well said. Walk us through briefly the East of Eden and the
Yeah.
corrections.
East of Eden is very important for understanding American history. So it has this element, either you're American or you're just interested in how this incredible country came to be and the extremely hard work that went into it. Of course, it's a universal, 100 Years of Solitude. Countless books are about, the first generation kind of working the land with the blood of their hands. And then the next generations coming and being more and more of a kind of symbolic generation. And so it's really important. It's a kind of a genesis story of the American West. But it's about much more. It's about the hereditability of sin, right? So you have, like, in 100 Years of Solitude, there is this mythological kind of penning sword above this family of incest, right? It's a small community in 100 Years of Solitude, which is one of my favorite novels. And the entire 100 years of the book, generation after generation, worries that this little like tail outgrowth on the babies that they think is the divine punishment for causing marriage will show up. And then there's one at the beginning and one at the end. But it messes up everybody's life throughout. And East of Eden has something similar that they use more the Cain and Abel story of one brother kind of in a figurative way murdering the other. And if you have siblings, that's a very sadly any sibling duo where there's only two children, you have this internal conflict. It's there in the Bible, it's there in mythology. There is something one against the other when it's a sibling situation. And there are generations of these brothers. And if you have a best friend, if you have like best friend can also be like in The Great Gatsby or Elena Ferrante's The Neapolitan Quartet. It's a duo of friends who are so close, it's basically siblings. In East of Eden, you have actual siblings, and we all have that. Like, it's just an extreme version,
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
what we're dealing with. And it's, the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle had this idea that we can assume that he was using earlier traditions, but he was the one who wrote it down, called catharsis, which means a purification. And Aristotle's idea was that when we engage with, he used theater as an example, but we can, use this example also for novels. One of the greatest utilities of engaging with fiction is that you can undergo the purification of extremely dramatic emotions around death, grief, pain, jealousy, murder, everything that you want, without actually having to do it. And that we
Yeah.
see, when you wonder why do people watch horror movies and get scared out of their boots, or why are people crying? Like, why is mom watching this romance and crying at the TV? Or why are you watching football and getting super angry and shouting at the table at the TV? Like those are cathartic moments when you are so lucky that you don't have to go through in reality those things, but you can still have the feeling and grow as a person, right?
Yeah.
That you don't want to
Hmm.
invade Normandy, but you do want, because that sucks and there's a high chance that you will die or get maimed or your best friend is going to expire in your hands, and that's horrible. But you do want to watch Saving Private Ryan
Hmm.
and then be
Yeah.
like, wow, it was almost like I was there. Yeah, but you didn't have to
Yeah.
be, and that's great.
Yeah, yeah. Can I ask you about we talked about some of these books are difficult to read.
Oh yeah.
And so I'm probably like a third of the way through Anna Karenina.
Yeah.
And there are these like they seem longish, these like longest stretches about I'm not totally following about like class wars and like farmers versus owners and like there definitely been these moments when I'm like if there's a two more chapters of this I'm gonna like actually put it down and read another like a complete other book. I'm like too much like Russian society
Yeah.
politics. How do you thread that line of like there are gonna be parts of these classics that are less relatable, that are harder to read with the reward or the gift that is the book itself?
This reminds me a little bit of, Tyler Cowen has this theory that there are type A holiday makers and type B. And like type A holiday
Okay.
makers are people who, they are like me. They're like, I want to sit on this terrace in Monaco, with a glass of champagne and look at the yachts under the sunset. And there are type B people who are like, I want to go rafting or climb this mountain. I'm like, no, life
Mhm.
is too hard. I'm not going to pay to give myself suffering and then afterwards feel good about myself. Um, it's kind of like that with reading as well. Like I just went on
Yeah.
holiday. I took, I don't know, 10 of French and John Grisham. And then there are moments when you give yourself the mountain and you're like, I want to be the kind of person who
Mm,
gave himself or herself this experience. But there are a couple
yeah.
of to-dos here, and I'm very happy to like break them. One is, first of all, you don't have to finish books. And if there is, like, I love War and Peace, but the 5-page description of the canons, I just flipped through because it wasn't
Mm,
written for me, right? These were
yeah.
written for a general audience, and they tried to give everybody everything. And these parts are not for me. Great. Thank you,
Yeah.
Tolstoy. Good for you. I don't care. And I'm not going to give up on this otherwise masterpiece because of this part. The other to
It's a
do
great point.
is a lot of books suck, right? Like your literature teacher in high school is not going to tell you this, but look at how a book was written. Some books are hard to read but are rewarding in the end, like Middlemarch. It's just like it was written in a very different era with very different, life rhythms, and it's trying to describe a slow rhythm of life. So it is in itself slow. Then you have, books written for quick enjoyment, like Jane Austen, right? The popularity of Jane Austen is because she's constantly trying to not have you drop your attention, right? Um, books that were written like Dickens, right? People, writers in the era when that became possible, who lived on writing and who produced periodical essays. Those were the TV series of the time. One of the reasons why we love reading Dickens still today, it's super exciting. Like every chapter ends in a
Yeah.
cliffhanger because it was written kind of like bit by bit. And Dickens wanted the next chapter to be commissioned by the magazine, right? And so you have that, and that's kind of a timeless thing.
Yeah.
So I would just really advise people, even if you have zero experience with fiction, to really trust your instincts, because the goal is not to read everything. The goal is to find out what you as a person like to read. And so start something, a good book, whether it was written 5 years ago or 500 years ago. If it's good storytelling, it will capture your
Yeah.
attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would much rather read, 10 books that you had such a great time with than start 100 and have a terrible time. Like, who benefits there? Nobody's watching you when you're reading these books. Like, you do whatever you want. Like, why
Yeah.
would you give
Yeah.
yourself a bad experience?
Totally. And one I think that the where you said it's like they spend 5 pages describing canons. I read Atonement, and I loved it. It's by Ian McEwan, and I
Yeah,
loved it. But there's like one middle section that's like all about, well, I guess, World War I.
yeah,
And, I just was like skimming it. I'm like, okay, like I don't need to know how every button on the soldier's uniform looks like. I
yeah.
appreciate that you did that. And similarly, I'm thinking about Anna Karenina, where it's like, okay, I don't this conflict between the peasants and the landowner is like, okay, I'm
That's
over it.
not
Like
for you. That was for a different
yeah, I know.
era.
But I want to know like what happens with Vronsky. Like
Yeah,
if
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's like
That's
Vronsky's
fine.
involved, like
Culture, give me the sex. That's also my
exactly.
Tolstoy. Like, good for you.
Ex
Yes.
exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. You know what? One other thing that's helped, I wonder if
I don't like
you've done
Ian
this.
McEwan. Like, I don't like Ian McEwan, and I
Yeah.
don't read him. That's completely fine to do also.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. One thing that has helped is with ChatGPT, especially for the classics. So I'll read like a book of like one of the books of Anna Karenina, and I'm like, did I get everything? And I think before I'd have like a little bit of like just like embarrassment with myself if I had like missed some like key idea or something. It's like I'm hard on myself in many regards. But this has been really enjoyable way to read it. Is at the end of every book, which is I don't know, maybe 100 pages or so. I asked ChatGPT, I'm like, pretend like I went to Yale. So pretend that you're a comparative literature, a literature professor at Yale, and we just finished reading book one. What are the key questions I should be reflecting on? And then
Oh,
it gives
that's
like 10
yeah,
questions. And, some I've missed, some I'm like spot on. And,
yeah,
if I was, and then the ones that are interesting, I'm like, how do you answer that question? Like, I could like sit and think, like, if I was a student, I would be like, okay, here's my
yeah.
view on what I think happened here. But like, I'm too fucking lazy. I'm here for the entertainment. But I'm like, that's an interesting angle that I hadn't thought about. How do you answer that question? And the cool thing is, when you can say no spoilers. So you're like, I just
Oh,
finished book one. What are the questions I should think about? No spoilers.
okay.
And
That's
so
really
it's
good.
been an incredible way to read what I would classify as like more difficult books.
I think this is really important, and especially if you're reading in kind of the idea-seeking way and not just wanting to be blindly entertained by all the shenanigans of the characters, which is also a completely legitimate thing to do. Like, you can
Yeah.
read Dostoevsky's The Idiot really just as a soap opera of these horrible Russian people screwing each other over and really messing with this guy's brain the whole while, or you can read it as an important 19th century novel from which I also seek to learn something and take away. And then whatever works for you. Like, some people, just hit up somebody that they know also read this book and initiate a conversation. Or like in Interintellect, obviously, there are all these discussions in our Discord. Or you can use an AI companion to have these conversations. I think it's like whatever works for you. I think every
Yeah.
human has a kind of fiction reading character. And what we need to do is to find who this person is and entertain this person. There is no right or wrong. And maybe one thing that our high school education in the West gets so wrong is pretending that there is a kind of uniform attitude that we should cultivate towards fiction reading, which to
Yeah.
me just seems it's really untrue. Like, it's like saying that
Yeah.
every person has the same relationship to food and what they like or love and what their love languages are. I mean, and also
Yeah.
you change from era to era. I recently started rereading for the first time one of my favorite novels after many years, and I had stage fright before I opened it because I thought, does it still work for me? I'm
Oh yeah.
12 years older. I've lived in 4 countries since I last read it. I've had tremendous amount of new experience. Will I still like it? And I was so relieved when I realized that this is still, to my mind, it's still genius. And
Yeah.
I was very, very highly entertained by it.
Yeah, I love that. You brought up this interesting point is like, I think when we go back to that question of, reading nonfiction, this question of are you here for the ideas or are you here for the entertainment? Right. And
Hmm.
I think that's an important distinction. Have you read the philosopher Kiran Setia?
No.
Um, he has a book. I forgot exactly what it's called, but in it he introduces these two concepts of telic activities and atelic activities. And so telic activities have there's an outcome associated with it,
Okay.
right? So like I might go to the gym to look a certain way,
Hmm.
right? Or I might read a book or listen to a podcast to acquire this new skill, right?
Hmm.
And then there's like AT-like activities like listening to music. You listen to music just because the enjoyment that it brings you in that moment.
Hmm.
And what I've found is that, to this group, and I put myself in this category, it's like I only read nonfiction. It's because it's not even about fiction or nonfiction. It's about making everything uh, toward everything you do towards the advancement of an outcome. Right. And I think that, kind of like capitalist, Western, educated folks, like, I think a lot of life is lost in that mindset that like everything, like if you start to think of your friends, it's like, well, can this person help me get a better job here? Or can they show me more deals? It's it becomes like a very slippery slope. And I was
Hmm.
reading, and I want to pivot to philosophy, but I was reading, he's like the internet philosopher now. He's so in vogue. Byung Chung Hal. Are you familiar with him?
Yes.
And like Burnout Generation and bunch of and they actually, interesting enough, these are like 50-page
Hmm.
philosophy books written in like very like almost like tweets, right? It's like the short sentences, no flowery prose or anything like that. But he has this argument that he puts forth in the Burnout Generation is that um, you know the influence of neoliberalism in that everything is a free market and there's no regulation and everything's a competition and you have to compete, right? Like it's like a system where if you don't compete you lose. And so he said that like we've gone from this what do you call it, an obedience society, where at first it
Hmm.
was like you can't marry someone of your same sex. If you're a peasant, you will always be a peasant. You can't drink beer, alcohol. You can't have sex, before marriage or whatever. So it's like there are all these rules of things you couldn't do.
Hmm.
Neoliberalism comes in, like rips out this, like rules are bad. And it's like there's no rules. And so then he said this obedience subject pivots, transforms to an achievement subject, where like
Hmm.
you are part of this market. And
Hmm.
so I think about this often because whether it's, another tangent to this conversation of nonfiction versus fiction is like podcasts versus music. Like my peers listen to so much less music because a
Hmm.
podcast is always like some form of bettering yourself. There's like a utility, and music is just indulgent, right? It's pleasure, it's leisure, it's entertainment. And so I didn't have a question in that. It was just kind of
Yeah.
an observation that this philosopher has like really impacted me.
I think that's really interesting, and we have to understand that since the earliest kind of you know literary legacies that we have from literal things carved into stone in the antiquity, people have always been worried about this stuff for different reasons. Sometimes in some eras we were worried about what noble title we can acquire. In other eras, we were, worried about whether we will go to heaven and whether God likes us. People always want to be better. I don't think that humanity would have achieved the kind of things that we have, which are sometimes really bad, right? If we haven't constantly been striving to outdo not each other, but ourselves, right? Like
Yeah.
one thing that most humans, except for a very small fraction of the world, believing in different philosophical structures, we don't want to feel that we're the same people this year as we were last year. It feels almost like a waste of resources. Like all these experiences happened to me. I had all these feelings. I solved all these problems, and I haven't grown.
Mhm.
Like then,
Yeah.
why am I suffering? Like one of the ways we make sense of suffering basically is learning from it, and then thinking I've learned, so maybe I can avoid it in the future. I think there is, so when we say nonfiction, I'm sensing that what you are talking about are these self-growth related books, because to my ears nonfiction can also be a history book, it can also be
Yeah,
a
that's
textbook,
true.
it can also be an autobiography or a biography.
Yeah.
And I think biographies are an interesting category of, it's not super utilitarian because okay, you're reading a book about, you know, Robert Moses or Napoleon, but for I think there's a gendered aspect to this as well. Like men are more drawn to nonfiction, and I do think that
Yeah.
autobiographies, and especially really well written biographies, can be for men the kind of stand-in for a novel. That I
Yeah.
respect that you are a very busy person, you carry sometimes a lot of, you know, burden on your shoulders, and you are not recharged by reading a novel. You are anxious because you feel that this is not directly helping you. Then a biography can be, and you see this on the internet, like how obsessed some
Yeah.
men are with biographies. Like that's great. Like this is not me trying to push fiction on people. This is
Yeah.
more kind of just encouraging everybody to give themselves permission to indulge in
Yeah.
good stories, wherever the story comes from, because it's the story
Yeah.
that you will. The story is the story that builds into your heart, and sometimes, you know, sometimes the realizations that we make when we encounter a good story are not pleasant, right? You
Yeah.
can be this type A striving person, you know, and feel empty or feel like, whose goals am I going for? Right? I mean,
Yeah.
you talk about
Mhm.
it, Paul Miller talks about like, whose game are you playing? And
Yeah.
it's fine to
Mhm.
sometimes feel kind of fallen out of grace and be like, I am unhappy. I am burnt out. I'm living somebody else's life. I don't know who I am.
Yeah.
I ticked all the boxes. You
Yeah.
know, I have kids, I went to Ivy League, whatever the boxes your parents or your society made for you. And I would much rather you had that realization, reading a good biography, reading a great novel, and sitting down on the bench in the park and be like, holy S, I need to think about this stuff, you know,
Mhm.
than
Mhm.
having a
Yeah.
major nervous breakdown. Like this is the catharsis, right? With Aristotle gives you this permission to face the biggest questions, the biggest tragedies, the stuff where none of us can make a shortcut. You have one soul and you are responsible for that. You have to guard it and keep it together, right? Because I always say that we kind of have an obligation to try and be happy in our soul, because otherwise we will treat others around ourselves more badly. So, yes, your
Yeah.
environment needs you to be at your best. And we often feel like there's no moment to sit down, which is part of what corrections is about. The
Yeah.
third book. Sometimes we feel that, you know, our family, our friends, they would not love us anymore if we stopped achieving things. But
Yeah.
then
Oh my, I mean,
will
that's
they?
the crux of everything I talk about, right?
Exactly. I mean, you embody this beautiful dilemma that everybody has in one way or another,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then, but there's also the other question, which is, would my family, my friends, my environment, my community truly benefit from me so aggressively living somebody else's life that I fall apart or I start treating them terribly, or I really drive myself to the point where I have to leave them because I'm suffocating. And to understand that you have this worry and so does everybody else around you. And the moment you start talking about it and you find a way for people to open up about these things, maybe that's when you become a community. And
Yeah.
so many friends of mine told me that it was actually their mom or their husbands who were like, let's slow down.
Yeah.
I see something
Yeah.
is up. And I think if you read a lot of fiction, it will also give you, I mean, if you read a lot of fiction, whatever a lot means for you, you will be exposed to the stories of far more people than you could be in your personal life,
Yeah.
right? Because time is limited, as you mentioned, right? Like people just have 24 hours and wider it goes there or there. And it's also good for sometimes just understanding what other people are going through.
Yeah.
And you're not going to learn it from a behavioral pop-psy book to look at your friend and say, you don't seem well. Do you want to take a walk and tell me what's going on?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
It's
maybe,
so, yeah.
yeah,
It's so small. Like, even like a Malcolm Gladwell, like some book like Outliers, right? I feel like every nonfiction book is written like Outliers now. Like story, study, takeaway, like every chapter. But the thing is that the things that people remember about, like the only thing I remember about Outliers is the stories, right? Like the
yeah,
hockey players with the January birthdays, 10,000 hours, the broken window. I think that was a different one, the broken window, turnstile policing in New York City, right? Like the only thing I remember about any of those books are the stories. And then from those stories, then I can kind of work backwards and be like, oh, this is what the point was, right? Not
yeah.
like, oh, remember that fact of, 90% of people, do this. The thing that
Whereas we know
you're also
that from
reminding me.
podcasts, and people don't remember anything from podcasts, actually. I
Oh,
think the
yeah.
research shows that, I'm sorry, listeners or viewers, you will take away, if you've taken notes, then maybe, but our auditive memory is very bad for humans. We are very visual
Yeah.
people.
Last question for you, which is actually not in the fiction category, but one personal struggle that I have with, with the examine life, even in the intro, it's like philosophical conversations, but I actually really struggle to read philosophy. I was a computer science major. I read a lot of that kind of like self-improvement canon for, 10, 15 years. But, I think I once picked up like, thus spoke, what is
Voracious crunch,
Zara
yeah.
Zarathustra. I'm like, what the
Not even
fuck?
the
Like,
big one. We were like, let
yeah, I'm
me
like,
door stopper. I'm sure that will
yeah.
cure my problem.
I have like Nico McCain ethics lying around, and it just, is that category, you put that in the mountain, like some days you got to scale the mountain, or because I feel like, I can't be motivated to read some the few that I've listed. I'm like, I can't be motivated to read those.
Yeah.
However, the Burnout Society, like I read that in like 3 days.
Yeah. That's a very interesting question. And here I would kind of group philosophy together with some primary source, political texts that people invoke, but very few people have read. Very few people actually
Mm,
sit down to read The Capital and Mein Kampf and things like that. But we talk
yeah.
about what's in them as if we had.
Mhm.
Definitely the bad writing rule applies to a lot of philosophers. Immanuel
Mhm.
Kant is famously unreadable, and so are many others. Philosophy books of like the classics were most definitely not written as periodicals. Like Immanuel Kant couldn't have given less of an F about whether you are enjoying reading this or not. Um, don't expect humor from German writers in wigs. That's not going to happen for you. Nietzsche had syphilis and gradually lost his marbles whilst writing books. So look at the context. So unless you're actually in academia and this is important for your work, I think what's very, very crucial about understanding philosophy is that even more so than novels, every work of philosophy is historically bound. Like it was written in a context. These were usually pieces that people wrote in conflict with one another, right? So they wrote it as a response to another book that you might not have read. So context matters greatly. Chronology
Yeah.
also. There's an actual field in philosophy called genealogy of thought, which is like what leads to what, the actual family tree of
Um,
these ideas. So it's a little bit like 1960s folk music in America, where like Nash wrote about Johnny Mitchell, and then Johnny Mitchell wrote about Leonard Cohen, and like it's like everybody's related. And it was a conversation between lines, right?
Yeah.
The other thing is, for many philosophers, and maybe my philosopher friends will hate me for saying this, it's also okay to read a secondary source. So
Mhm.
if you find a really good book on Aristotle with like good quotes and putting it in context for you, and it's easier for you to read than the original, where you might not know the
Yeah.
Greek original and there are footnotes, and it's a linguistically harder for you to just
Yeah.
go through, then it's completely fine to read the book about Aristotle. There are some great, like Nigel Warburton wrote an excellent short history of philosophy. The Will
Oh, I
Durant, the
actually own that book. Yeah.
yeah, story of
I've never read
philosophy.
it, but I own it.
It's great. It just will tell you, and then you read it, and then you're like, wow, this, I don't know, Horkheimer guy seemed really interesting.
Yeah.
Let me, now that I have the context and will understand it better, let me now go and seek out the origin.
Yeah. I love
But there
that.
are also philosophers who are excellent writers, like Nick Bostrom, Parfit, like read their papers. You know, you don't have to read the whole book, like read the 3-page paper. Thomas Nagel, great, right? It's like short little thought experiments. You know, Kierkegaard, like you don't have to read either or, which is like 2,000 pages. You can read Fear and Trembling, and it's a story,
Mhm.
it's a parable, and it's beautiful and deep, and you will understand it. You know, Nietzsche, you don't have to necessarily go to Zarathustra. You can read The Birth of Tragedy, which it
Okay.
lays down the foundations of his ethics. And, you know, maybe, I mean, I'm not saying it's an easy read, but it's, you know, something where you will have something to, like, if you just know a little bit about Greek drama or can visualize it, you will have an understanding.
Yeah.
You will, maybe you don't have time to read, you know, Martha Nussbaum, or you don't, or it seems scary, but you can, you know, watch the interview she gave to Bill Moyers in the 80s, where she explains her thesis about human goodness. And it's completely fine. Like, the point of reading
Yeah.
philosophy is that you can internalize, put the idea in your own head and see if
Yeah.
it's useful. And you can, like learning a language, you learn a new word in Spanish, the goal is to use it, right?
Yeah.
If you don't use it, you
Yeah.
will forget. um
Yeah.
and then on the other hand, there are some thinkers where you, like, I remember I was reading 0 to 1 at the beginning of my startup founder journey, and I had this very strong feeling while I was reading it that this is a neo-Hegelian book, that it's built on Hegel, because you see the structure that is thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which is the foundation of Hegelian historical thought. It's called the dialectic, right? So you have
Yeah.
something happens, then the opposite happens, that in a very kind of, um, you know, very Eastern way, it's the combination that will win.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is a kind of counter to the earlier Christian way of like good versus bad, like very Manichaean, like it's either or, it's zero
Mhm.
sum. And Hegel gives you this flexibility, and you realize like, oh, Peter Thiel actually uses the system to explain a lot of events in our industry and how money works. And that's useful. Other people
Yeah.
will read Girard, right? Like they will read his religious philosophy to try to understand something's happening in politics or in business. You know, in psychology, or in some parts of research, people are very deeply influenced by Hume. So when a couple of years ago, the psychologist Alison Gopnik figured out that Hume was actually directly influenced. He was one of the first thinkers in the West to be influenced by Buddhism. And he didn't come
Ah.
up out of thin air with this idea that there is no self, which then went on to greatly influence human thought. It's good to
Wow.
understand that, you know, one of the simplest takeaway from that can be that it's always worth looking at the origin,
Yeah.
right? What
Yeah.
is that?
The genealogy, like you said, of the
Exactly.
ideas too. Yeah.
Because then you
Yeah.
realize, like, well, your ideas are coming from somewhere.
Mhm.
It's completely worth for you to finish that blog post that you think is stupid and no one will read it. Because if just
Mhm.
one good person reads it, your idea
Yeah.
will pay it forward, and then everything is related. And I
Yeah.
think that is a very empowering thought to know that
Mhm.
the world's the world's kind of edifice of ideas was built by normal human people like you and me, who are
Hmm.
just producing things and creating things and talking and writing. And even if for whatever reason that little piece that you're working on today is not going to be the most successful thing ever in the history of things, it's never lost.
Hmm.
Energy is never
Yeah.
lost. Somebody's listening,
Yeah.
somebody's reading. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
I agree, and that's such a beautiful way for us to wrap. I think is also one of the best takeaways that I had is like it's almost like you just like give permission. It's like you do you, right? Like if you don't
Yeah,
want to read Aristotle, just like read a summary of it. Like that's fine. If you don't want to read the section
find
about
out what
the
this
the
class is
war,
about.
skip. Yeah, exactly. So. And this has been a true pleasure. Actually going to go. I'm going to pick Anna Karenina back up. So, um, tell our listeners and viewers where they can go learn more about you and intellect and all your great things.
Of course. Come to Interact events online or offline around the world. We're very kind of hubbing in LA, SF, San Diego, Austin, Miami, Atlanta, DC, Philly, New York, New Haven, Boston, London, Berlin, Bangalore, wherever you are in the world. We want to hang out with you. And then we're also online. Most of our events are public and on the internet. So you can just book a ticket, hop on board. And if you want to join the Intellect community, then you're also, invited into our community Discord, where some of these conversations are ongoing and you can witness other people happening upon some of the best readings or podcast experiences of their lives. But you can also share your writing and what you're reading and what your takeaways are.
Amazing. And that's at interintellect dot
Interintellect.com, very
com.
creatively. .com. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anna.
Thank you so much.